next presentation is from Daniel Spichtinger and Marcel Laflamme. Both are experts in open science. And we are going now to a topic on what are the drivers for open science and how to make researchers more reusing of data. I think a very important and a very interesting topic. Please, Daniel, please, Marcel, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present together with Marcel. So I'm going to share the screen, but we are both going to do it in tandem. So some slides I'm going to present and some slides Marcel is going to present. All right, so Marcel and I are going to present the results of a paper that we developed when we were both working at the Open Innovation in Science Center from the Ludwig Boltzmann Gesellschaft. And we wrote the paper together with Marion Pötz, based on the results of our study on data reuse. So I'm going to jump right in with starting a little bit with the policy background, because I'm always interested in open science policy and how what we do on the ground relates to policy, how policy can also support open science practices. Generally, of course, we all know that policymakers and research funders increasingly seek to promote open research data, open access, and open science. Beyond that, on a more general level, the European Union has developed or is developing at the moment the data strategy, which is actually a bundle of different legislative measures that go and kind of develop the EU's approach to data beyond GDPR, so beyond personal data. And as part of that, they want to set up data spaces for the sharing of data that is secure, stays in Europe, and allows a high level of access, but is also safe. And they try to do that, or they plan to do that in different thematic areas. And for also the Ludwig Boltzmann Gesellschaft, it's very relevant. One of the first ones to be implemented, the health data space, health data being very, very valuable, but also quite complex to implement. And our approach here is, this is all very nice to have, and you've got a lot of hurdles to implement it, technically, but also legal hurdles. But even we assume that those will be solved. Actually, even if we share the data, the scientific and societal value of open data can only be realized if actually somebody uses the data once it is available. And so our starting point was a little bit to actually look at what are the factors that influence whether research data that is available is actually being reused by the researchers. So that was the starting point for the study on data reuse that we conducted in 2018 and 2019. And the resulting publication was out earlier this year. So from the scholarly context, from the academic context, we see that you have a large amount of studies on data sharing, not so much on data reuse, but now a distinct literature on data reuse as such has also begun to emerge. So basically, we have numerous factors that facilitate or block research data reuse, and those have been identified. But how this is actually, in effect, this knowledge is yet limited. And existing research seldom distinguishes between using data once, or reusing data once, and actually making this, I would say, into a habit, right? So doing it consistently and recurringly. And so for the research question, I think I'll hand over to Marcel.
Thanks, Daniel. Yes, and thanks everyone for the chance to be here and to share this work with you today. So yeah, I mean, as Daniel said, I mean, this scholarship on kind of factors influencing data reuse, and I should say here we're thinking not necessarily just about research data that was created for the purpose of scientific research, but also, as Daniel said, things like health data, personal data, so data that's of interest to researchers, whether or not it was created for that purpose. And so, yeah, I think for our study, we saw that there was work in place on these factors influencing data reuse. There was a really nice systematic review that we were able to build on, but really asking what's the mechanism by which those factors, which have now been sort of established in the literature, what's the mechanism by which they're activated in what we talk about as a propensity to engage in reuse behavior. So as Daniel says, not just engaging in reuse on a one-time basis, maybe with a particular set of extrinsic rewards as part of a grant or as part of a program of study, but to really make reuse part of one's scientific practice, part of the normal way that someone conducts research. So our study was trying to understand the mechanism by which those factors express themselves in a propensity to engage in reuse. So Daniel, if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the methods that we use to investigate that question. We really took an exploratory and a qualitative approach to this. There were sort of existing large-scale surveys that were done, again, trying to get at these factors themselves. But since what we were interested in is sort of the tissue that connects those factors together, right, and that links them up into scientific practice, there wasn't data that we felt like we could reuse to sort of answer that question, and so we did conduct interviews with both researchers who had reused data in the past, as well as intermediaries of different kinds, right? So librarians, folks who manage repositories in different fields. So yeah, we were interested in both who's actually reusing data and then who are the professionals in the science system who are charged with facilitating reuse in one way or another. So we conducted initially these oral interviews and then did a round of written follow-up specifically with the researchers to sort of validate some of the findings from the first stage of our study, which we can talk about a little bit later on. Daniel, if you go to the next slide, and I think this might be back over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I would say as a first result, we were actually able to confirm the importance of factors that are already known, right? So that have previously appeared in the literature, and we actually grouped them into two clusters: project dependent factors, so depending on a specific project, specific data set, and project independent factors. So maybe starting with the independent factors, that would be the data characteristics. So what we could refer to as fairness of data, although not all of the interviewees use the term fairness, but it comes across as, we can group it into these acronyms of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Secondly, whether I'm actually just having a look. Sorry, I think I just realized that I made a mistake here, because of course, when you think about it, these are the first set of factors, right, which are the data, those ones. I'll jump to the next slide here. I mean, so the first set is actually the project dependent factors, because of course, the data characteristics, the fairness of data, that depends on a specific data set in question. So I think if it's okay for you, I will also revise the slides and send them again, that there is no confusion. But when we start talking about the project independent factors, so those that are dependent on a certain data set, we see that the data characteristics are important, and it's important whether the researchers actually trust the data. So they look at the data, right, and they see, is the quality high? So this is this concept of the quality of data. And do I know the context? Can I make sense of the data? Because of course, data is always depending on the context. Is it suitable for purpose? Again, this is actually clear why it's project dependent, because I have a certain research question I have as a researcher, then I have a data set and I must judge, is it suitable for the research that I actually want to do? So is it suitable for purpose? And last but not least, for the project dependent factors, is the capability to reuse it. So as a researcher, do I have the capabilities, the skills, the knowledge to reuse the data? And then we come to the project independent factors, which are the researcher's attitudes towards data sharing, the norm in the community in which the researcher is embedded, and the rewards and the requirements. And this is, of course, also dependent on external organizations, funders, policymakers. So let me go back and actually change this right here, just to be clear. So I'll go back in the screen, full screen mode. So I think, do I have to change again the, no, never mind. Okay, so those are the factors that are already there in the literature. And you can already see that we actually found something what we consider quite new as well, which you can see here, is this additional factor that is, in our view, quite central, which is researcher subjectification, which actually is important to answer the question, will data reuse occur more than once, right? As we said, was our research question, will there be this propensity of engaging in data reuse? Will there be reuse data on a regular basis? And Marcel, you are going to say a bit more about this of subjectification that we found is really an important aspect that hasn't really been covered in the literature so far.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I'm not sure that we're at in the presenter mode yet. There we go. Yeah, perfect.
I just changed it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, as Daniel said, if we have these 7 factors, sort of 3 project independent, 4 project dependent, that again, that wasn't really the novelty of our study to identify those factors, although kind of grouping them in the way that we did in terms of project dependent and project independent is something that hadn't been done previously. But I mean, as we analyzed our data, right, and those of you who work with qualitative data can probably kind of empathize with this moment where, you know, you have a coding scheme in mind and you know what you're looking for, and then it just feels like there's something left over, right? There's something that your existing categories just haven't been able to explain. And often there's a process of going back to the literature and sort of trying to understand what you're seeing and to sort of to make sense of it. So I think, you know, for us, kind of identifying subjectification as the mechanism that activates these factors really was a sort of inductive thing that came out of the study. I mean, that's what exploratory work allows you to do, right, is to sort of read between the lines of your data and try to understand the patterns that are contained within it. So I'll kind of give our definition of subjectification first. I'll talk a little bit about where the concept comes from, and then I'll say a bit about sort of, you know, where we saw that in our data in particular. So we define subjectification as a multi-level process, so operating at both the individual level and the institutional level. But it's a process whereby researchers come to see themselves as data reusers and intermediaries, right? So repository managers and other facilitators seek to bring about this self-understanding on the part of researchers, right? So really kind of taking those 2 pieces of it together and understanding them as interconnected. So subjectification was a concept first developed by the critical theorist Michel Foucault. And, you know, we can think about the concept for him as really being about the production of a socially legible kind of person, right? And this person is both, it's sort of a play on words in a way, the idea of a subject, or in French, assujettissement is the term that he uses, but a person who is both the subject of their own thoughts and desires and the things that they want to do, and also subjected to the shaping of those thoughts and desires, right? So in a way, subjectification is also about power acting on the subject as the subject forms. And again, that's that multi-level nature of the concept that's really important. Subsequently, others have worked on subjectification, including in scientific contexts. Those of you based in Vienna may know Lisa Siegel, who's a science and technology researcher based at the University of Vienna, wrote a paper about this that really influenced our thinking. And I would say, yeah, it's a concept that's related to, but I guess a bit distinct from other concepts like identity or persona that other researchers have worked on. In Q&A, we can say more about that if that's of interest. But if we go to the next slide, I'll just talk a bit about sort of really encountering this concept in our data. And I should be clear, no interviewee told us, the reason that I reuse data is because I was subjectified, right? So it's not that language or that construct was used by our interviewees, but it was a pattern, this idea of coming to see oneself as a data reuser that we encountered in half of the interviews that we did, sort of explicitly in the coding that we did. We encountered this idea of coming to see oneself as a data reuser. And that was expressed in a variety of ways. So some concepts that were used, the idea of a mindset, the idea of becoming aware of something. On the part of intermediaries, there was the idea of advocacy, of sort of bringing about that understanding on the part of researchers. And again, our work in analyzing the data was to sort of splice together those different kind of disconnected constructs into a concept that also comes out of the literature. And one quote that I thought I'd share, because I think it nicely shows both sides of this multi-level process. So this is an intermediary who we interviewed from the UK, and this interviewee said that researchers can suddenly realize that their knowledge and this other person's knowledge can make something new, and that can be exciting, right? So this is this process on the researcher side of kind of coming to this sense of oneself as a reuser. But then I think that the second piece is no less important, right? And there's a bit of frustration in this interviewee's tone now as she goes on to say, but for some reason, some researchers are blind to the benefits of doing this and doing it well. So I think it's important to capture both pieces of that here, right? This sort of excitement around coming to see oneself as a reuser. But in the second part, there's definitely this sort of, application of advocacy, or what Foucault would talk about in terms of power, right? Of saying, researchers ought to work in this way, and those who don't are in some ways kind of frustrating scientific progress or standing in the way of kind of the greater potential for data to be exploited. And again, the concept of subjectification really tries to hold those two in tension with one another, and not to sort of just tell a happy story about sort of coming to a new identity. Like, both sides of that are really important. In terms of our design, once we identified that initial pattern, we did sort of validate it with these written follow-up questions to researchers, where we explicitly asked, do you see yourself as a data reuser, right? That wasn't a question that we asked in as many words in the interviews, but really asking that question point blank and correlating it with the respondents' other answers. One finding there, and again, I mean, it's a small sample, but we did find that seeing oneself as a reuser was linked to frequency of reuse, right? So respondents who said, yes, I see myself as a reuser, also self-reported reusing data more often than once. And researchers who said, no, I don't see myself as a data reuser. I've reused data in the past, but I don't see myself as a reuser. The reasons that they gave for that often had to do with frequency, right? I don't do it very often, and therefore I don't see myself as a reuser. So if we go on to the next slide, and yeah, I'll talk a little bit about maybe the implications of this for research in this area on kind of reuse. And then Daniel can kind of give a bit of broader context as well about institutions and policy. So to me, I mean, bringing this construct of subjectification into the literature, we do think is a contribution. You know, I would say that reuse is an area where theorization there hasn't been a lot of theorization to date, right? So a lot of reuse studies will just use kind of off-the-shelf models like the theory of planned behavior, which really has a sort of an individual focus. Some of you may be familiar with kind of the knowledge infrastructures research program that Christine Borgman and others have developed, which, you know, we also think has a lot of value, but really is at that institutional level, and doesn't have a lot to say about individual decision-making. So for us, you know, the contribution of this study really is about bringing this multi-level construct into the conversation around reuse. But that said, I think there's room to kind of operationalize it more precisely, right? To not rely so heavily on kind of plain language terms like seeing oneself as a reuser. So our co-author Marian is sort of interested in kind of scale development around subjectification to really measure it more precisely. You know, and you can imagine kind of doing larger studies, you know, with a larger sample size. I think a longitudinal design would be a really interesting way to carry this work forward, so that, you know, you could sort of test the effects of subjectification over time, whether it stays steady, whether it sort of fades, whether it's reinforced by subsequent reuse. And yeah, Daniel, why don't I pass it over to you for the last 2 points there?
Yeah, I mean, for institutions, so institutions, organizations, I think one of the lessons we can draw from that, they should be involved in creating purpose-built settings for subjectification. So you could, could even call it safe spaces, so that we can experiment with reuse in a safe space, and also for critical deliberation about the uses of reuse. And of course, especially in my mind, is what does this mean for EU initiatives? We could think about the European Open Science Cloud, but also more recently, the data spaces that really are going to be set up. And we see that actually this isn't really a discussion, I think, at least as far as I know, in the data spaces. How are we actually getting researchers to reuse the data? A lot of the discussion is more technical and legal, but not what we actually do once the data spaces are there. And so here, the initiatives that are going on, there are some EU-funded support projects. I think it could be valuable for them to take into account and to tackle and to think about how can we facilitate subjectification as a concept, so that the data that we actually provide is, with a lot of work is then actually reused. So how can we integrate this in our activities as data spaces or projects supporting the setup of the data spaces? And I think as the last part, we also wanted to get your feedback here, because it's always interesting what the audience thinks. And we have prepared 2 questions. So the first one would be whether, in your own work as either researchers or as intermediaries, facilitators, whether you think, have you actually observed this project or this process of subjectification in your work? And the second one, how can we go about building services and infrastructures with subjectification in mind? And also, last but not least, if you want, to dig deeper, the full paper was published in PLOS, so it's of course open access. And we also provide the data set at Austar. So the data set is provided with a scientific reuse license. So it's not a Creative Commons license, but if you really want to dig deeper into the data, it's also available. And last but not least, those are our contacts. If you want to get in touch. So we both have moved on from the Open Innovation and Science Center. I'm still with the Ludwig Boltzmann Gesellschaft, but in another function. And Marcel is now working from PLOS. So I'm very grateful you took the time also from the States, which is a little bit behind, of course, in the time. So for you, it's early morning. But let's go back to the discussion. And I would be curious to see whether there is some input from the audience.
Yeah, we should say when we were happy to answer other questions as well, but yeah, in the time that we have remaining, yeah, we're curious to hear what people might say on either of those points.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Marcel. It was very interesting to hear us about, and I will give now your questions to the audience, the other way around in this case.
Well, as we said, you know, if the audience also has some questions they want to ask us, of course, we're also happy to answer.
I was curious. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and for bringing a little bit of theorization in this topic. I was curious about, you know, you can see a correlation between frequency of reuse and having this awareness that you are a data reuser. I think like that your direction is more in the sense of, you know, having this awareness and this activates data reuse. But I wonder maybe if you could say something more about, you know, the possible causal relation between these two elements. So is it because you get used to reuse data that you have then this awareness, or it's the awareness actually that prompts you to say, okay, if I want to be a researcher, then I have to reuse data? You know, different contexts with different research environments, it can go either way. So I come from a very strong, let's say, a research field where there is a very strong identitary function, which is like classical philology. If you are a philologist, you have to do this, or if you are a textbook critic, you have to do this. So really this awareness brings us to do something, but, you know, it really depends on the situation. So I was really curious about, you know, this, like, does it go in one direction or the other direction, or both directions, and in which context?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say is that the model that Daniel showed sort of briefly does have this sort of loop back from recurring reuse to subjectification. And so I think that's something that, you know, given the kind of constraints of our study, I wouldn't make a strong causal claim around that. But I think, yeah, I think it is both the case that if you were in a field where reuse is really the norm from the beginning, and how would you even do the work without, you know, without reuse, then I think definitely that can precede the behavior of reuse, right? That you train in a particular field and you sort of understand that reuse is just how you do science, how you do scholarship. Mm-hmm. I think in other cases, it is actually the activity, the practice of reuse, and seeing that that is successful, right? That sort of allows you to accomplish your research aims, that then feeds back into kind of strengthens and solidifies that subjectification as, you know, maybe everyone in my field doesn't reuse data, but I do, right? Because it allows me to do X, Y, and Z, or it aligns me with the open science movement, which I see myself as aligned with. So yeah, I mean, for me, that sort of loop from behavior back to subjectification is a really important piece of this.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe also from my side, I put up the model again, yeah, because that's one of the our key outcomes. But maybe also to add, because I think we have it here, right, that we identified this reuse pattern in 12 out of 24 interviews, so half of them. And I found it also interesting, and maybe if we have time for an extended presentation, I think it would be interesting in the future to put up this quote, because I also remember one of the interviewees, researchers saying, okay, I started out with the idea of reusing data and I did it. But if I had known before how much work this would be, I don't think I would have done it. And I'm not sure I would do it again, right? So this is somebody who kind of reused data, but encountered a lot of obstacles along the way, and then decided, okay, I did it once, but it's so much effort, I'm probably not gonna do this again. So we also found the other side, right? That people were actually not doing it once, but not really developing into habitual reusers.
Yeah. No, that is really interesting because, you know, I think it's also, you know, if strategies to enhance data reuse, it really depends sometimes on also the disciplinary context in which you're working in, and so might be more difficult in some fields than in other fields. And you know, sometimes people, I think they have the feeling that, you know, I reuse data, but then yeah, I come out with such messy or maybe data with mistakes, and then it's better if I do everything by myself, like, you know, manuscript transcriptions, for example, stuff like that. And yeah,
I mean, that's you know, that was exactly what you say. That's also something we encountered, right? People saying that I expected to get a nice and clean data set because I think in this case, the person said it was from a source that actually advertised that and said, you know, we have such great data. And then they get it and they realize, no, it's actually not great data. I have to put in a lot of work to clean this data. And that's one of the factors, the context-dependent or project-dependent factors that in this case, in this project, the data characteristics, in this case, they didn't talk about fairness, but more the quality of the data was not such that it lent itself to easy reuse. So they had to put in a lot of work, and then they said, okay, I did it once, but I'm probably not going to do this again.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
That's a very interesting discussion. And also coming back to your questions about what kind of infrastructure do you need? I'm thinking more about the infrastructures, and also to make it clear how I see infrastructure. So infrastructure is not only the machine sitting somewhere and providing software. Infrastructure is also people who are doing support and people who are helping to get the data, to work with the data, to put data inside of an infrastructure and get also data outside of an infrastructure. And in this case, I think it makes me think now about do we need also some playgrounds in the way that researcher can work with data and see what they get in one hand, and on the other side, is it necessary also to think more about services? Because cleaning up data is always on the perspective of how you want to use the data. So when you put data inside of a repository, you may want to have it in a very raw format, because then you can have more options in reusing this. The other way is when you want to reuse it, then you have a special use case in mind, and depending on this use case, you are cleaning the data. So is it necessary also to think about in this way what kind of services are necessary to help researchers to reuse the data?
Yeah, I'll say I came away from a real admiration. Some of the repositories whose staff we interviewed for this project, I think I learned a lot in the context of this project about the kinds of value-added services that Raman is describing. So yeah, whether it's visualization, whether it's sort of you know, making things ready for sort of cloud computing. But yeah, I mean, the sort of the work that repositories are doing, not just to sort of steward, not just to make discoverable, but also to sort of enable data to be queried in a specific way, which is sort of field dependent and which might accelerate that process of reuse relative to just sort of serving up raw data and telling the researcher, you figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, this was part of the paper. So I just actually had a look into the paper where we actually discussed this. And you have the link, of course, on the slides. And I was just trying to see if I can even, no, it doesn't let me post. Unfortunately, it doesn't let me copy. But if you like, we can shortly look at it. So here you can see that actually this availability and what kind of support services do you need, that was actually mentioned by several intermediaries. So it was definitely something that that was discussed. And do you need easy usable tools? And if you have a database which is easily usable, is it then actually necessary to still train the researchers, right? Because another aspect that was sometimes mentioned was training. And there were two different and contrasting views on that. Some people said, yes, we should invest in training for the researchers. Others were saying, well, if the database is well done, you actually don't need training. And of course, then there was also this issue that was mentioned that it's not just infrastructure in support services, but also things like, data stewards that can actually help with this kind of work. So it was definitely one of the intertwined things. And you can see that one factors are always kind of intertwined with others that we also did, that was also discussed. And that was something that the people we interviewed, a number of them brought up.
This is really very interesting, and I think you will be a good candidate for a podcast series.
Oh, very nice. Happy to do that. I mean, I hope, Marcel, you too.
Sure, that would be lovely.
Yeah,
it would be very nice.
Because it was really great, and I think it's also we're thinking too much in the way of it's important that we think about the data and how to make the data able to reuse it. But we should also focus a little bit more on the perspective of the actual user and the reuser and what's their needs are really. I think this is quite nice.
I think, there's also this I encountered this criticism of the so-called build it and they will come approach, right? So this idea that you just put an infrastructure, a digital infrastructure out there, and then this assumption, okay, I have the infrastructure, the users will come. And very often the users don't come. And so that's why indeed it is important to take the user needs into account when designing them.
Yes, that's a crazy situation, and a lot of people have this idea in mind. I think this idea came from these things like Facebook or something like this. They just build it, and then all the people rushed in and do this and are very happy about this. But this is not the reality. This happens maybe once, and also there you had already community, and you need to do something for this. So anyway, it was really a great insight and a great presentation. Does anyone have a comment or a question? If no, then I say thank you to Marcel, thank you to Daniel.
Thank you.
And I think we are now coming to an end. Susanne?
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much.